This is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom show, The Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carrboro, 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch this show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10 p.m., Friday morning at 6 a.m., or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, Wilf Wake Up Call. I'm Mira Schwinzer here with our hosts, Lori Hoyt and Emily Keel. Emily O'Hare on the camera, and we're expecting our special guest, Erika Wilson, any moment.
Hi, thank you, Iris. I just want to put an underline under the fact that we are now on YouTube. This is only a couple of weeks old that Iris worked her magic, and with the help of Rebecca Cerise, who was on our show about a month ago, and so we are now very happily on YouTube. So no excuses, folks. You can get us at any time, and the magic way to do that is to go to WILP, W-I-L-P-F, go to WILP Wake Up Call and on YouTube, and that will bring you to us. And we have probably about 4 shows on there now, and we're waiting for our guest. But we're delighted to have Emily Keel, one of our Wilf sisters, who is going to be co-interviewer with me today, because Emily has been one of the most faithful and involved Wilf members with the Silent Sam. And so, and she's the one that's been doing all the contact with Professor Erika Wilson. So we're going to start off, so while we're waiting for the professor, we're going to start off with Emily Keel. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and so there may be somebody approaching. Yes, there's somebody at the door right now.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think this may be our guest. So Emily, you have been very faithful with the Silent Sam and making the contacts about that, the student contacts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and all Wilf members, I would say, or a core group anyway, have been very supportive of the student movement.
In a core group, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And here comes our guest.
Mhm.
Welcome. There's a seat for you right over there. We're glad that you can make it. I know the traffic is fierce at this time. It was worse today than usual, and I think people are, I don't know, doing what, probably Christmas shopping, what.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you could come here. We're delighted to have you.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we're getting started, and I was just saying how Emily Keel has been one of our most faithful Wilf sisters with Silent Sam, and I just want to call to everybody's attention that there was an editorial or op-ed in the News and Observer, and I meant to bring it, and of course I forgot it, but how somebody was writing in that they should be, that with time, right now they're giving such a hard time to the student activists and calling it's a mob and blah, 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 and saying, you know, with time, in some years from now, maybe 10, 15 years, they're going to be talking about the Maya Little Center on campus. They're going to be honoring the people who have been so involved, and that was so delightful to read. The appreciation for the people who have been risking so much to be out there, particularly Maya and a few others who, are still facing problems with the university. So we'll get right to it. So, can I call you Erika?
Yes, please do.
Okay, I'm Lori, and you know Emily, and this is another Emily on the camera. So I understand that you've been working on a court thing about Title 20?
So what's been happening
Yeah, tell us all about it.
is that when Silent Sam was still up on the pedestal, we were looking at different legal arguments as to why the monument should not be on the pedestal. And so the university has taken the position that this state law required them to keep the monument on the pedestal. And so essentially the genesis of this is working with Hampton Dillinger in my capacity as advisor for the Black Law Students Association. Our goal really was to explore and to put before the university alternative legal narratives that might be used to explain why the monument shouldn't be on the pedestal. And so one of the areas of law that had not been explored and is getting a little bit more attention, I'm happy to see, is this idea that the monument, its presence conflicts with federal law, the federal civil rights laws, particularly the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There's are two provisions, Title VI, which applies to schools, and Title VII, which applies to employers. So the university could be liable under both provisions to the extent that the monument creates a racially hostile environment for both students, faculty, and staff. And so, to be clear, there's no lawsuit. What ultimately happened was that the students signed on to a letter that went to Chancellor Folt and some other university officials explaining this is an issue. The presence of the monument creates a racially hostile environment, and unfortunately, that argument didn't seem to carry much weight with them. And a while later, as we know, the monument was removed through an act of civil disobedience, which is a matter of law, puts us in a different landscape in terms of legal arguments that might be used as to what happens next from a federal civil rights perspective, at least.
Okay. I didn't mention that you're a professor at the law school.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we should at least mention that, yeah. So, Emily, I know you've been working on this for a long time. You have.
Well, yes, I've eagerly awaited this chance to meet because I've read some of your comments on social media, and you're concerned about the UNC community and the administration's support of the Confederate monument. I'm curious, let's see, I'll just say by way of introduction, you've been here since 2012. You're a UCLA Law School graduate, is that right? And you are the Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Professor in Public Policy.
Oh, wow.
At the School of Law.
Congratulations.
Yes. And you came in 2012. Can you say something about what your initial feelings were then as a faculty member, learning about Sam at that time, and how your feelings have changed?
So I have to start from the beginning, right? I came to UNC in 2012 from a school in Maryland, and so this was my first sustained period of time being in the South to begin with. Although my parents both grew up in the deep South in Arkansas and Louisiana, respectively. And so when my father passed away, but when I told my mother I was taking the job here in North Carolina, she actually had some reservations given her history growing up in the Jim Crow South. And so I would say I was probably on campus about maybe a couple of months when I started to learn about the Silent Sam monument and the history of the monument. And so for me personally, it hit close to home because this was my first time really dealing in a very tangible way with the legacy of slavery, discrimination in the South in particular. And also on a personal level, given my family's own interactions in the South, in Arkansas in particular, with Klan-like terrorist groups, this concerned me that a public university would have a monument like that on its campus, especially given the dedication ceremony and the words used by Julian Carr and when the monument went up. And so I was frankly a little bit surprised that it remained in 2012, and then I think it hit its apex right after the massacres in Charleston and when the Confederate flag came down in Charleston. And so that's when at least my activism around it really ramped up, I would say.
Yeah, it's a shocking thing to all of us, really. We talked about the students saying it creates a racially hostile environment, and that's really obvious to me when supporters of the Confederacy are allowed to gather on campus periodically and display flags and promote their affinity for the monument and the stump that's left there now. They're overt in their history, in support of the history of the past, and in the denial that we know regarding slavery and its importance to the economy and the society of the past. I read someone who said recently that the statue's removal was an act of defense against a constant reminder of a racial order prescribed by Klansmen and former slave owners. Was that you? I don't know who to attribute that to.
No, that was not me, but I 100% agree with that statement.
It may have been from Maya Little, the student organizer, but it's certainly evidence for a hostile environment. I can understand that. And one of the judges in Orange County at the trials for some of the students, Judge Scarlett, after one of the hearings, said, I asked the leadership of the university, if your goal is to teach a diverse community of students, what are you doing to assure that they all feel emotionally and physically safe? Another profound statement, I guess, recognizing the problems. Her feelings certainly support the civil rights violation, I think. There was a Washington Post article today. This is one of the neat things these days. I can see what she read today on Twitter. There was a Washington Post article that proposes that racism is a national security issue. I was blocked from reading that. Did you?
I did get a chance to read it. It was Cheryl Eiffel had an op-ed in the Washington Post. Cheryl Eiffel is the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and so essentially the argument that she was making is, given what we've learned about the Russian social media efforts to basically suppress the black vote, it goes to show that they try to take advantage of an obvious fault line in our country in terms of race and race relations, and that it is that's evidence that it is a national security threat, and that we do need to take that seriously and do something about it.
I agree with that. Just looking at, I've had conversations with a number of people in the community who say that there have been monuments to Civil War soldiers forever in public places, in courthouses, town squares, parks. And no one complained about it for years. So what has changed to bring about complaints?
I mean, my first response to that would be, just because something has happened for a long time doesn't make it right or just. Even if it's happened under sanction of law, it's important to keep in mind that slavery was legal, right? Slavery was a legal status. And so eventually our times changed, and we recognize that things, even that are given the sanction of the law or the state, aren't necessarily morally just or right. So I think what has happened is that there's been a greater awareness and awakening around the history surrounding the construction of those monuments. A lot of people don't understand that the monuments came up not immediately after the Civil War, but basically at the genesis of Jim Crow, during a time period where the idea was to stamp a definite racial order and caste in the South, throughout the country. I would say you can look in places like Idaho and Montana, who had nothing to do with the Confederacy, and you might find some of these monuments to the Confederate in places like that as well. And so I think what has happened, why the question becomes, why do we care now? I think the question should be, why didn't we care then? Not to interrogate why we care now, but the bottom line is that thankfully, there's been an awakening, an awareness of the history behind the construction of those monuments. And frankly, I would say with the election of President Barack Obama, maybe at least temporarily, and I might get myself in trouble here because I don't want to overstate this, temporarily an idea that African Americans can be full-fledged citizens of the United States. I don't think that has always been an accepted norm, not even after the passing of the 14th Amendment. I think that anti-blackness is generally so deeply embedded in the history of the country, within our social fabric, that when we have a scenario like this where monuments to the Confederacy are starting to come down, people actually have the temerity to ask why, when they should be asking why not, because it has become a default position or assumption in America that African Americans will accept second-class citizenship and should be okay with signs of racial terror all around them.
Yeah, and I think African Americans have always asked for the monuments to be removed or spoken out about it, and certainly the awareness on the part of others is more recent.
Well, I'm thinking when they're saying what has changed,
Mhm.
actually, you would think the monuments maybe would have come down as we ended Jim Crow. Why did that go on? And so Jim Crow was accepted, and this was, at least by the whites, and this went on for a long time, and there was a whole civil rights movement to change that, and these monuments are a residue that should have been changed at that time as we ended Jim Crow, but, you know, they've hung around, and it's not surprising that at some point their time would have come, especially because you're right, they did not go up as a memorial right after the war. It was right initiating the whole Jim Crow era in the teens and the 20s, and the Daughters of the Confederacy were the ones who, it wasn't like the citizens said, oh, let's get this monument up. They pushed all over the South, and they're still pushing. They haven't given up on that.
Absolutely, their work is still in progress.
They're still wanting that, the honoring the Confederacy and not wanting to say anything about that. Essentially, it was treason.
Right. I mean, I had someone email me the other day who actually raised a perspective I hadn't considered. Someone whose ancestors actually fought on the side of the North, who attended Chapel Hill, and said when he passed that monument, he had feelings that this was disrespectful to his ancestors who fought for the salvation of the Union, and so to see a monument to what are essentially people who committed treason sort of spit in the face of his ancestors. So I think there are a lot of arguments all the way around. That's one that I hadn't considered before, but I think it's also important to note that perspective.
That is interesting. And this is hard to believe, but my grandfather was in the Civil War, and was
Really?
yes. My father was nearly 50 when I was born, and he was nearly 50 when my father was born. So it's hard to believe, right? Many people say that's not possible.
It's
but
not that much in the past.
It's not. That's how recent it was.
The past is still with us, obviously.
Yeah, and but he was in the Civil War and fought on the side of the Confederacy, but none of us, his descendants, support the reason that he fought. None of us support the slavery and the economy that was based on that. So
What
things
state?
changed.
Excuse me. What state did?
North Carolina.
Oh, was North Carolina?
Yep. Yep. There's an interesting quote I saw from a African American who was a newspaper reporter, a journalist in Richmond, Virginia, during Reconstruction. He was also on the town council, and they were entertaining the idea, I think it was 1840s, they were entertaining the idea of erecting a Robert E. Lee statue, which they ultimately did. He fought against that, and it passed, and a bond was passed before the people to pay for the Confederate monument, and it was erected. He wrote in the paper at that time about it. Just let me find that interesting quote. He said that he wrote in the Richmond paper, this glorification of states' right doctrine, the right of secession, and the honoring of men who represented that cause, fosters in the Republic the spirit of rebellion, and will ultimately result in the handing down to generations unborn a legacy of treason and blood. I think that was certainly it has borne itself out in recent years. And just want to talk a little bit about the recent plans. The Board of Trustees came out first with Chancellor Folt to announce the plans to build a $5.3 million statue or a museum to house the statue, which required a lot of security and a great deal of yearly annual cost, and to try to keep the Board of Governors from following through with that. Maya Little and others had a rally that very night, I guess that was December 3rd, had a rally with hundreds of people, hundreds of students and hundreds of community supporters and they had a peaceful rally starting at Peace and Justice Plaza. Maya Little, a student leader, addressed the crowd, and she announced their plans for the teaching assistants to withhold final grades, and as a means to try to force the Board of Governors to not go through with these shameful plans. The Board of Governors then met, I guess 5 days ago now, and one of the board members said when 80 people, the teaching assistants, these 80 people decide how the flagship university in the entire system is run, that's not democracy, that's extortion, that's terrorism. He proposed a motion, and the board passed the motion to direct the Committee on University Governance to review policies regarding the students, faculty, and staff conduct and propose changes that set clear expectations for conduct, propose sanctions for the students, suspensions, termination, expulsion for those engaged in activities that we just named, and throughout all the university system. You mentioned particularly disobeying lawful orders of officers and inciting riots, participation in riotous acts. Who gets to decide how to define riotous acts? I mean, Maya was arrested that very night for inciting a riot in what was a very peaceful activity of walking around several streets in Chapel Hill and on the campus, and that seems incredible that they would deem that a riot.
Yeah, so the first thing to note is there's a lot of discretion, right, in making these kind of charges, right? So I actually printed out the text of the statute to read the text of the charge, inciting a riot, right? And it says, a riot is a public disturbance involving an assemblage of 3 or more persons which by disorderly and violent conduct or imminent threat of disorderly and violent conduct results in injury or damage to persons or property, or creates a clear and present danger of injury or damage to persons or property. And so I wanted to read that because you see the language in the law is relatively broad, right? It doesn't say that you actually have to cause injury. It can just be a threat of injury, and so that is maybe subject to interpretation in that a charging officer, for example, could interpret conduct to fall within those parameters. And so it's important to contextualize a charge like that within the broader context of criminalization of behavior generally. We see this particularly with racial disparities and how laws are enforced and who gets charged with certain things and who doesn't. So I suppose to answer your question, right, the reason why she might be charged with something like that is because the law is relatively broad and because there is a great deal of discretion in terms of how one might interpret certain behavior.
And that is state law, I guess.
That's right. It's a North Carolina state law.
Was this charged by campus police?
UNC police, yes, UNC police.
And, you know, that's so disappointing. You would think UNC police are there to protect students, and you'd think that they would be much more sympathetic to students, but it seems like they treat, at least my impression is, treating the students like the usurpers, and then when the outsiders come in, they seem to have protected status. These Alamance guys come in and they get escorted hither and thither, and that's just something at some point I'm hoping will get addressed. Are the campus police for the students, or who are they working to protect?
I mean, I think, and I might get in a little trouble here for this anyway, I think policing generally, not just at UNC, but everywhere, is a political question. We never talk about it like that. Who gets policed, who doesn't, how do certain groups get policed, why do certain groups not get policed in a certain way. You can never remove those questions or issues from the political context in which we all operate. And so to the extent that the students, for example, at UNC or the activists are seen as disrupting the status quo, as a threat to the status quo, then it makes more sense why the policing patterns are what they are. I'm not saying it's right, but that may explain it.
Yeah, it explains it, but it still is something that at some point, needs to be brought up, I think, with the administration, what orders do they give them? If there's a football game, there's all kinds of rowdy behavior, if you want to say, disruptive behavior. But that's not, I guess, not disrupting what they think is the status quo. That's an expectation, but it brings up why these things so differentially handled and how the police look at it.
Right, well, how apparently on a number of occasions, people after a sporting event have painted the Silent Sam statue without any repercussions and
Oh, really? That
yes, and my little was charged with a crime, and there was an enormous controversy about the cost to get the paint off and so forth when that doesn't really take place after reveling that is perhaps due to drunken behavior.
Yeah.
So very different treatments.
Well, and police, I mean, I know, like at the Chapel Hill Police, that they are being given some training to be more racially sensitive. It may be a while before it's where people want it to be, but they're aware that the police do need some training, and I think Chief Blue is pretty good about trying to make things better in terms of the issues we're talking about, how police treat people. And I'm just raising the question that at some point, it seems to me that the university police need to be given some training about, the students are one of the main reasons there's a university, and I think that they need to be treated with more respect than protesting is a civil right, it's a legal right. But anyhow, I don't want to belabor that point, but that's...
Absolutely, you make good points. That's one of the chants students often give is, who do you protect, who do you serve, to the police, because
Exactly.
it is not apparent that they're there for them. And in fact, they do feel like they are targets and considered the
Yes.
instigators of violence.
That's the impression I have from some meetings
It's
where
absolutely the way
how
they
they
feel.
were treated, how some faculty were treated.
Mhm.
Iris is giving me the signal we take a station break right now, and we're sharing mics.
This is Will's Wake Up Call on WCOMLP, Chapel Hill and Carver, 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMFM.org.
Do we have any announcements? I don't think so. We don't have any announcements. I think that is normally a pretty slow time, although the way things are these days, there's never a slow time. But so far, I will just say that the Progressive Democrats met last night, or meeting tonight, and right around the corner on Lloyd Street at the Democratic headquarters at 7 o'clock. So if anybody's listening, that's a very good group to start thinking about joining or going and attending. And I just want to throw that out there too. Okay, I think we'll get back. Our guest tonight is Professor Erika Wilson, professor at the law school, and Emily Keel, one of our Wolf sisters, is co-interviewing with me, doing the main interviewing, and we'll carry on. Okay, Emily, Erika.
Thank you. It seems to me that the arrests and citations are all fairly arbitrary. It really does look at times like they're just trying to weed out some of the protesters. In fact, there were, I think, 25 students arrested in the multiple events, including and following the toppling of Sam. And many of those, I think most of them have been to trial. A lot of them have been given community service. Nobody's been given a significant sentence of anything beyond community service. And yet each one of those students is prevented from going back onto the McCorkle place where the Sam stump remains. They are prevented by the university, who will charge them with trespassing if they do that. And they could, I guess, travel across the place for to a destination, but they cannot linger at any time on the place. And that's an obvious attempt, I think, to reduce some of the most ardent supporters of the cause, to take those people out of the rallies. And UNC police differs from Chapel Hill police in that they don't really have a community. They're responsible to, well, they should be responsible to the faculty and students, shouldn't they? But they really don't have any feedback, don't ask for any feedback from them, so they're different from the Chapel Hill police, which has an advisory committee and listens to other feedback. But I think that's a dangerous thing, that they don't have any source of control, I guess. Perhaps the chancellor and board of governors, but not to the people that they actually monitor. Do you have any feelings about that, or is it?
I mean, I just go back to the bottom line when it comes to policing is that discretion is huge. I mean,
Yes.
Police have a great deal of discretion in terms of how they interpret certain behaviors and what that means. So I do think the points that you mentioned about training, conversation is really important. I mean, I won't deny that police officers have a difficult job. My uncle's a police officer in Compton, California. It doesn't get any tougher than that.
Oh, boy.
Oh.
However, it's such a tough job. We need to make sure that we have people doing the job who are given the training they need to do the job well, and who are able to protect and serve, as the saying goes. And so protecting and serving doesn't mean always that you are trying to stamp out dissent. I think there's a big distinction there, and that we have to be careful that we don't get into scenarios where policing is not really about protecting and serving, but it's about quashing dissent.
Is that a civil rights issue, the attempts to quash dissent?
I mean, I think there are a number of ways you could frame this, right? I mean, I think to the extent that one might read the effort to profile certain students, for example, that could be a civil rights issue. To the extent that one could read it as an attempt to stamp out what might be First Amendment kinds of speech activities, that could also be a civil rights issue. But I want to be careful in how I say this. I think it's context specific, depending on the individual case and the facts in an individual case. I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, but to just point out that in certain scenarios it could implicate civil rights issues, and so that is probably a very lawyerly answer.
Well, we expect you to have lawyerly answers. So is there in the background, is there still some hope of having a suit against the university for the civil rights violations, or where does that?
So I think that a lot depends on what happens next, right? I think that right now the monument is nowhere, and so I think there's an argument now, at least, that there's not a viable thing to sue about necessarily.
So the threat of reinstating it does not constitute a.
Yeah, and so in the absence of some concrete thing that is going to happen, I think it's would be challenging to successfully initiate a civil rights lawsuit. If the monument were still up, I think we're in a different scenario.
So, and I hope that does not come to pass at all. The along with the suggestion of erecting a $5 million building for the Confederate monument, when the Board of Governors met, they also had a committee of law enforcement people meet to talk about the rising violence on college campuses now, which they want to meet with a rising militaristic band of people. They, in fact, suggested force of 40 in a mobile unit that could react to violence all over the whole university system when needed. And I think it's it's a $2 million a year endeavor to fund this, and a $500,000 initial investment in equipment for them. And that militaristic response just is so amazing. I think even just seeing a police in riot gear escalates the response enormously, I think, upon anybody who's peacefully demonstrating. How do you
Yeah.
feel about those concerns?
So I think, as I said earlier, the decision as to how we police is a political decision, and so I think again taking a broader view of this. I mean, we've seen throughout the country militarization as the response to protest and dissent. I think Ferguson, Missouri, is a good example of that, right? We really saw some heavy military tactics there, and so I think you see that trickling down in local areas, in areas across the country, like here in Chapel Hill. And so it's a curious and maybe lacks a little bit of imagination how that proposal was set up. I mean, you could imagine that if one was really seriously concerned about increasing violence on college campuses, for example, as they articulate, that the first or the most immediate response is the militarization of police is disappointing, frankly. I mean,
Yes.
I think there are other more creative solutions. If there is a legitimate concern about this, there are other more creative solutions that might be tried. For example, using the police as a response to so-called rising violence on college campuses is really just a Band-Aid. It doesn't address the source problem. If one really accepts the proposition that there is increasing violence on college campuses, and I'm not saying I accept that proposition, I'm just saying the terms of as they've been set out, you could opt for other things. You could opt for more counselors or other sort of more restorative justice kinds of methods to get at the problem that you've identified. The fact that police, militarized police, are the option should be troubling, that we aren't thinking outside the box, that we aren't thinking more creatively, particularly because you're dealing with the student population. So yes, I think there are better alternatives, I'll put it that way.
As far as I know, there have not been any real concerted efforts on the part of the administration or the chancellor to meet with students, even something as simple as that, to just meet and talk about the problems, to hear them. I think feeling heard goes a long way towards restoring some faith in the system.
Yeah, I think when they were trying to decide initially what the plan was going to be in terms of re-erecting Silent Sam, there were some listening sessions, but I think it's important to distinguish meetings and listening for the sake of showing that you're doing it and actually making people feel heard in a meaningful way. I think that latter point is something that I hope, especially now that there's going to be additional time to reconsider another plan, I hope that's something that is taken seriously, not just to convene a series of meetings where students show face, but to actually have students have a meaningful opportunity to be heard, to have an opportunity to review any plan that's actually going to be put forward as the final plan, for example, and to give input. And that's something that unfortunately didn't happen the first time around.
That's been a very disappointing thing, that the administration has not seen any point in doing those things and or making a concerted effort to do those things.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. I was heartened, at least in the paper, where a lot of faculty, the black faculty, the faculty as a whole, have seemed to me to take a pretty strong stand in support of the students wanting the statue out of there, the reasons why, and I have to wonder, with so much of the faculty signing letters and taking a stand, which can be courageous for some of them. Some may feel pretty safe with tenure, some may not. And when talking about listening and meetings, is the administration meeting with all these other people who have a vested interest or who care a lot, who the universities where they're making their life, their profession?
So I think, so for example, I've met with the chancellor and had conversations with her. So I think in fairness to them, I think there are some meetings taking place. I think for me, the key question is not necessarily the meetings themselves, but, you know, what do you do with that information that comes out of the meeting? How do people walk away from a meeting like that feeling heard, feeling like your opinion or input matters? And so one of the things that we have to be careful about is that students, faculty, staff feeling like the process is not legitimate. To the extent that people lose faith in the process, they're less likely to participate. So it's a two-pronged thing as I see it. The first is the administration actually taking steps to meet with more folks, more students, more faculty, more staff. But equally, if not more important, is not just meeting for the sake of meeting to say that we met, but actually having some tangible end result of those meetings so that people feel like that their voices are being heard. I think a lot of people at the university were upset, for example, with the grading strike, and so
The what's right?
the grading strike or the proposed strike in terms of submitting
Oh,
grades.
the grading, yeah.
Right. And so that is the natural end result of what may happen when people don't feel heard, when people do feel disaffected, that they are going to
Up the ante.
Right, exactly. So I think the university, the administration should have a vested interest this time around in making sure that people are heard, that these meetings do take place, but that it's not just for show, that something tangible actually comes out of that.
And I wondered, is part of showing something tangible, do they say that they'll take this list of recommendations to the Board of Governors, or does the Board of Governors, do they show any interest in listening to representatives of the faculty and students, or do they just glean everything they know from the newspapers? Do you know anything about
You
that?
know, Harry Smith, the chairperson, I think, referred to having met with students, although has anyone found out who those students were? It certainly wasn't the student protesters, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't know exactly who the students were. I do know that a meeting did take place with some students and faculty, and so that did happen. And so, I mean, I think part of the issue is that there needs, generally speaking, I would say there needs to be more openness. I think there's a level of distrust when people feel like things are being done under the cover of night, when things are not made open and apparent, for example. And so the administration, the university administration would probably disagree with what I'm saying in terms of level of openness, but I do think that maybe some students and faculty don't feel that everything is being done in an open manner, and don't feel that their voices are being heard, and so I think that's something that needs to change. I would also say one point that has not been really touched upon a lot, another really important source of pressure that needs to be applied is to the state legislature, right? I think that a lot of efforts, there's been a lot of activism around what the university is going to do in terms of re-erecting the statute or not. There needs to be equal, if not more, pressure placed on the state legislature to change the law in terms of that state law that seems restrictive in terms of what can be done. I think that's an important next step as we push to make sure this monument doesn't come back, is to also apply or make our voices heard about what we think about what should happen with this state law.
Great point.
Yeah, in regards to that, I just wondered, did the university send a delegation to the state legislature to say how important it would be to get, I mean, you know, you wonder about the communication in all levels there. And
that was one of the statements that the chair of the Board of Governors made the other day as well, that perhaps the Board of Trustees would want to have a conversation with the legislature. And actually, Governor Cooper today or yesterday in an interview said that he thought that the legislature should reconsider having communities and the university be more involved in decision-making about the Confederate monuments that they're faced with, which was a mild thing to say, but good.
well, and he's the one who sort of told the chancellor way back that he thinks that because of student safety, that they could go ahead, but they were too afraid to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line, and I've said this before, is that as much as this is a legal question in terms of the state law and what I think is even more important, the federal civil rights law, this is a political question. I think we can't run and hide from that. And I think the strategy to have Silent Sam not placed back on this campus is a political one and not a legal one, and we've got to be honest about that, and we have to take steps through the political process to change the law.
Yeah, and I don't know, I know we had some gains in the recent election, and I'm not sure if when they come back, whether that could create some new kinds of conversations in the legislature. I'm always an optimist and have some hope, but that would be something to wait and see on, I guess, after January. Yeah.
Right. I mean, my hope would be, right, the ideal solution would be to have the law changed through the political process. I mean, that is probably,
Yes.
given the realities of the politics as they are in the state, may not happen. And so to the extent that what I've just said about changing the law is not going to happen anytime soon, I also think there are ways to use the federal laws, especially, to push back against the state law. If the state law is not going to be changed, I think that part of the job here should be pushing on federal law, pushing on the interpretation of that state law to ensure that the monument is not returned to the campus at UNC Chapel Hill. I've heard university administrators say they would prefer the monument not be on campus, and so
At all,
right? And so I think if that is accurate, then I think they should take steps to ensure that to push back against the law to the extent that we can't get the state law changed anytime soon.
Yeah.
And I think the town of Chapel Hill and Carver has some responsibility in that. I think members of the community ought to have public outrage at what's taking place and involve the town councils in lobbying the administration to do things and lobbying the legislators. I think there's just some apathy, and at some point when there is violence, for sure, that will change, but why don't we circumvent that?
Didn't they come out and say they wanted the statue?
I think they made a statement, but I
But
mean,
they made a
it's
statement, but did they do more than that?
continued hammering of the issue is called for, I think.
And for the safety in the town to have these
Exactly.
people coming in who are, have an ideology of hate, have an ideology of wanting to support white supremacy. I mean, that's not good for the town or for, so they have good reason to go to the legislature. Now, whether they'll be listened to very much, the legislature's pretty, I've heard, remarks in the past about how they look at Chapel Hill, but and I'm afraid that might still be the way they look at it. But all of us, and certainly, because I just want to, as a relatively new person in this state, Erika, I would just like to mention that until recent years, this state had the reputation of being one of the more progressive of the southern states.
I remember.
And so that was what the hope was, and that's what led us to, when I moved here in the '60s, was one of the reasons we were willing to accept the transfer. But excuse me. Okay, he's our main mechanic here.
You mentioned the article in the paper. I think you were talking about the opinion piece of recent. Was Mark Driscoll was a professor of Asian and Global Studies at UNC.
Yeah.
And wrote a very compelling opinion piece, I think. He talked about the pride with which people comment on their activity during the 50s and 60s, racial discord, and even if they didn't, many of us recall things we didn't
They
exactly
tried to act like they had done more during the civil rights movement. Oh, and before that kind of stuff, I also want to mention that the Smithsonian Magazine, I think this month, or maybe by now it was last month, they had a long article about this issue all over the country.
Financial support by the government, taxpayers.
Yeah, $4 million.
It was 40 million.
Or 40 million, yeah.
In
I'm
10
sorry.
years.
40 million over the last 10 years has been spent maintaining statues and groups and everything that are the same thing we're facing with Silent Sam. And it's just gone unnoticed, and it's coming now to the forefront like Silent Sam has to. Yeah, why didn't people notice this before, but now, and that's good. I mean, I think now, because some places have to, we've got to remember that even South Carolina, which was considered much more racist than North Carolina, took down the flag.
Right.
After a catastrophic loss.
I know, but that
Yeah.
catastrophic loss affects us too. We were
Sure.
all aware of that.
It can happen here.
That should have been the catalyst, but
Yeah.
anyhow.
I mean, I think the most unfortunate thing about the Silent Sam controversy is that in terms of combating white supremacy, it's actually low-hanging fruit. So it worries me that we are entrenched in this battle about removing a monument that's an obvious relic symbol of white supremacy when there are even more tangible and pernicious forms of white supremacy on the campus, in the community, that go unaddressed. So for all of the energy that we are spending trying to fight what I think again is low-hanging fruit, should we have a Confederate monument on our campus, all the energy expended doing that, we are not addressing other really important and problematic aspects of white supremacy that are frankly going to be harder to address and require much more sophistication and nuance. If we can't get this right, it saddens me in terms of our ability to tackle other issues that are much more complex, much more difficult to solve.
What are some of the examples that you're thinking of when you say that?
So I'm thinking of things like disparities in policing, racialized disparities in policing, racialized wealth gap, the fact that, the sort of representation of underrepresented minority groups on campus, that we are going to be waged in this battle over race-conscious admissions at the university.
Mm-hmm.
These are all really important things that go to racial justice and racial equity that aren't being discussed, the momentum is not being used to fight them as aggressively as we should. That's not to say that people are not working on these issues. Of course people are working on these issues. My only point is that this issue with the monument, of the issues that I've just addressed, should be low-hanging fruit, and it's not. And the fact that it's not worries me in terms of hope for addressing some of the more systemic issues.
I think we all feel that I think it's been a shock that after the tragedies that have happened, that where other states, even further south, have responded, that this state could not respond. I think that's been very upsetting. We only have a couple minutes left. We're talking to Professor Erika Wilson and Emily Keel of Wilf. And is there some last statement that to leave us with? What would be, if people are interested, because we don't have a newspaper anymore here, we still have the News and Observer, but is there some place, can people get in touch with you, or some place you would recommend to keep abreast of what's happening?
Twitter. That sounds crazy, but
It's the
Okay.
place that students communicate,
right,
right?
it is, and there's a lot of great information circulating on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter, Erika_K_Wilson on Twitter. I try and
And Strike Down Sam on Twitter is
Yes.
a place that students post a lot of information. Very
Okay.
helpful.
Maya Little is on Twitter.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. I wanna thank Professor Erika Wilson. I wanna thank Emily Keel
Thank you.
for coming with this tragic situation. I mean, that's become a tragedy here. That you're right, the amount of energy, the amount of angst, and it's sort of uncovering so much. We've touched on that tonight about how the students are treated, about how the university is showing such poor leadership to really stand up firmer and take take hold of this. And so it's an ongoing thing. We hope it'll get better. We have to keep working at it. It's not going to be easy, I don't think, no matter what. Thank you both of you so much. And we're going to take a break next Wednesday for Christmas, and we'll be back in January with the new year. Hopefully.